So recently, the federal government had to step in after America's 16th biggest bank collapsed under a lethal combination of reckless management, unexpectedly high interest rates, and a highly deregulated environment. Whereas Republicans are blaming wokeness. So before we dive into this particular cesspool, I gotta wind the clock back and we gotta go ankle deep in a cesspool in which we already visited, which is the East Palestine, Ohio train derailment. You're probably thinking, what the hell does that have to do with the bank collapse? But just bear with me. So even though there are 1,000 train derailments per year on average, the East Palestine train derailment by a train owned by Norfolk Southern earned national attention. And even though there are no fatalities, even though federal authorities were there on site like the EPA, and it was being managed by state and local authorities in Ohio and Pennsylvania, and it's being investigated and being managed even as we speak, it earned quite a bit of media attention. Right-wing media pounced on it instantly because it was a bad thing that happened while Joe Biden is president. Therefore, by their calculation, it is Joe Biden's fault, even if he had nothing directly to do with it. And the mainstream media followed suit because we always allow the right-wing media to just dictate the terms of the debate and the discussion. And you don't want to be called, some lefty soy boy, or, you don't want to be considered a left-wing apologist or a shill for the Democratic Party. So anything that the right goes with, you got to follow suit. And that's what happened in East Palestine. Now, when you looked at it further, what you found was under President Obama, despite the lobbying of the rail industry, the Obama administration and Democrats imposed stricter regulations on the rail industry with respect to their brakes. And then under the Trump administration, Republicans rolled that back, okay? And the rail industry lobbies to both parties. So Democrats are hardly angels in this, but it's a problem that is, per usual, particularly worse with Republicans. They oppose stricter regulation. They oppose regulation in general. That's a conservative ethic. That's a conservative staple. The idea that you let the invisible hand of the free market just do its thing, baby. Keep government out of business, right? The left generally wants more and stricter regulation of business by government, and the right, generally speaking, opposes that. That's where we are with East Palestine. And now we have a situation with a bank collapse, and the plot is eerily similar. So what we have is the 16th biggest bank in the United States, Silicon Valley Bank, based out of California. And a couple of days ago, it collapsed, and the federal government had to step in because what the federal government wants to avoid at all costs is this being the first domino or the first pebble in an avalanche that would cause another banking catastrophe like the 2008 Great Recession. So the federal government stepped in. They seized control of Silicon Valley Bank. They fired the management, and they're going to sell off its assets to to compensate the depositors. So people who deposited into Silicon Valley Bank, people who actually used Silicon Valley Bank, people who banked with them, they're going to be covered. According to the reports, there are enough assets owned by Silicon Valley Bank to compensate the depositors. So if you banked with Silicon Valley Bank, you'll be fine. Okay? Now the investors, not so much. As President Biden said, investors, they took a risk investing in Silicon Valley Bank. The bank collapsed. That's capitalism, all right? So it's not going to be a bailout for the investors, and it's not going to be a bailout for the executives. The executives are fired. The investors took a risk. The risk didn't pay out. The depositors, people who's actually just used the bank, as banks are intended to be used, they're going to be covered. They're going to be compensated. So as far as we can tell, the federal government is behaving responsibly. And one of the reasons they're doing so is to make sure that there is no self-fulfilling prophecy. Because when you have a situation like, stock markets and speculation and things like that, investor concern, investor fears, investor anxiety, that's a major factor in financial crises, right? So they want to assuage people's fears. Guys, don't freak out. This is not a harbinger of things to come unless you make it that way. So just don't freak out. This was a relatively unique situation, and we are taking aggressive steps to curtail it. But now you have a situation where it's political. Of course it is. Joe Biden is still president, and anything bad that happens while Joe Biden is president, if he's involved or even if he's not involved, even if it has nothing to do with him, to Republicans and conservatives, it's his fault because he's president. And to be fair to them, or rather to vindicate that very cynical calculus. That's how the American people tends to feel about presidents, or tend to feel about presidents. We look at them as like an easily identified figure to either credit when things are going well or blame when things are going bad, regardless of whether or not they played a role in any of those things. So very often we give presidents credit, too much credit, for things that they didn't really do or didn't play as big of a role in. And very often we blame them too much for things that were outside of their control. And so it's a constant game played by Republicans and Democrats. Republicans just do it better, unfortunately. And so Republicans have a culprit identified. It's not just the Biden administration. It's wokeness. Okay, and I was looking for a compilation of clips so you could hear it straight from the horse's mouth, so to speak. And Brian Tyler Cohen's the only one I found, so I want to quickly play this clip so you can hear this straight from Republicans and conservative thought leaders about why SVB collapsed.
First, here's what Republicans have been saying is the cause of Silicon Valley Bank's failure.
And then we see now coming out that they were one of the most woke banks in their quest for the ESG type policy.
And these banks are badly run because everybody is focused on diversity.
Well, you should know that Cecilia Rouse has been thinking a lot about this. When she worked at Princeton, which is a university in New Jersey, she wrote her research agenda on diversity, equity, and inclusion.
So you have Tucker Carlson, a major, conservative thought leader. You have James Comer, the first guy who is a sitting member of the Republican Congress. He's the leader of the Republican Oversight Committee. And then I don't know who the hell the middle guy was. He looked like the Crypt Keeper. But anyway, this is a consensus of conservative thoughts, wokeness, right? Because SVB didn't employ just white people, because one of its executives has a scholarly history of emphasizing diversity, equity, and inclusion, wokeness is really responsible, not regulation, deregulation, poorly enforced regulation, not reckless management, nothing like that. It's wokeness. It's the liberal, socialist, commie agenda. Now, they don't offer much by way of evidence of that, but even more sophisticated people, right, and the Wall Street Journal, right, which is a highly respected publication, but it is conservative, even in an op-ed discussing the issue, they went out of their way to kind of throw some shade at diversity, equity, inclusion. Was there regulatory failure? Perhaps. SVB was regulated like a bank, but looked more like a money market fund. Then there's this. In its proxy statement, SVB notes that besides 91% of their board being independent and 45% women, they also have one black, one LGBTQ+, and 2 veterans. I'm not saying 12 white men could have avoided this mess, but the company may have been distracted by diversity demands. Now, this is really stupid and tactless because a couple of things. First, the implicit assumption is that the 45% the 45% women executives on the board, and the one black person on the board, and the one LGBTQ+ member in management, and the 2 veterans were somehow just less capable of running a bank than 12 white men. Now, he does say, listen, I'm not saying that 12 white men would have done more, but I mean, they hired people who weren't white, so maybe they were distracted. Like, hiring people who aren't white is so sweeping and comprehensive and time-consuming that you have to hire to try to find a qualified minority or a qualified LGBTQ person or qualified veterans. My God, you basically have to dedicate your entire corporate focus to that, and there's no way you can't do anything else. It's a stupid implication. It's a stupid insinuation. And it's a desperate attempt by, in this case, a conservative op-ed writer to distract from the fact that this was clearly a failure of deregulation. The fact of the matter is, there are people out there who are not white who are capable of running banks, as well as white people. As a matter of fact, this op-ed journalist probably forgot this, but during the Great Recession of 2008, do you know who were the people who were running the banks? It was white people, a lot of white guys. And they presided over a banking catastrophe, the likes of which we had not seen since the Great Depression. The Great Depression, oh my God, another one. And we know there weren't women or black people or LGBTQ people running banks during the Great Depression, right? So every financial catastrophe that's ever occurred in this country has been virtually every time dominated by white people. White people have been in power governmentally and in the private sector and in the financial sector when these catastrophes occurs. So the implication he's making is not only tacky and tactless and insulting, it's also verifiably wrong. So this guy's an idiot. Everybody should make fun of him. But the other thing I want to draw your attention to is actually a really good article by the Tampa Bay Times about these two competing narratives. Is deregulation responsible? Is wokeness responsible? Silicon Valley Bank failure. Were Trump policies or woke efforts to blame? Okay. And so you've got some names in here like Lawrence G. Baxter, a law professor at Duke University and a director of its global financial markets sector. Remember that? So in 2018, President Trump and all 50 Republican senators and 17 Democratic senators approved legislation. The all 50 Republicans, 17 Democrats, they wrote legislation, and President Trump signed it into law, which rolled back regulations that were passed under the Dodd-Frank Act after the Great Recession. So President Obama and mostly Democrats signed into law this Dodd-Frank Act legislation, which would more strictly regulate banks after the Great Recession to avoid the Great Recession. The legislation signed by Trump in 2018 represented a scaling back of the landmark Dodd-Frank Act, which lawmakers passed in 2010 and then President Barack Obama signed. The 2010 measure was designed to increase financial services regulation in a way that would avoid a repeat of the crisis that tipped the nation into the Great Recession. The Dodd-Frank bill, passed mostly by congressional Democrats with a smattering of Republican support, overhauled and strengthened the nation's financial regulatory system, tightening restrictions on speculative or risky investments, and instituting stress tests on banks to make sure they could survive difficult financial scenarios. The 2018 revisions of Dodd-Frank, formerly known as the Economic Growth, Regulatory Relief, and Consumer Protection Act, maintained stringent oversight for the largest banks, but eased regulations for smaller and mid-sized banks, of which Silicon Valley Bank qualified. Okay? The bill passed with the support of all but one Republican and of 33 Democrats in the House and all Republicans and 17 Democrats in the Senate. So it was technically bipartisan. Democrats do deserve some share of the blame here, but this was mostly a conservative and Republican effort signed into law by a Republican and conservative president. Now, experts say in banking regulation told PolitiFact that the 2018 changes probably did hasten Silicon Valley Bank's downfall. It did indeed reduce regulatory requirements for banks like Silicon Valley Bank, said Hillary Allen, an American university law professor. While it is impossible to say categorically that the legislative rollback equals the bank's collapse, it does seem that it made it more likely. Lawrence Baxter agreed with Allen. Relaxing some of the regulation for regional banks sent a signal that they were not a threat to economic stability, which is naive, as we have seen. Okay? But, as they point out, the bank failure can't be entirely blamed by change in the Dodd-Frank law. He and others said that the bank's heavy reliance on one sector, high-tech startups, was ill-advised and should have been rectified sooner, regardless of changes to the law. And Econoboy does a great breakdown of this on his channel, and I'll link you to it, because, of course, SVB was specifically dedicated to the tech industry, which is seeing constrictions right now, and specifically tech startups, which are risky, period. So it's not like this is entirely the result of deregulation, but as they acknowledge, stricter regulation and preserving the regulation which passed under the Dodd-Frank Act, largely a Democratic initiative, could have prevented this, or could have reduced this, rather. What about the role of woke policies? Several high-profile Republicans and a presidential hopeful argued that Silicon Valley Bank's promotion of diversity, equity, inclusion, or DEI initiatives and environmental, social, and governance, or ESG investments led to its downfall. Ron DeSantis, governor of Florida, U.S. Representative James Comer of Texas, who we just heard, and Republican presidential candidate Vivek Ramaswamy echoed that sentiment in comments to Fox News. Let me scroll down here. But experts told PolitiFact that none of the policies or investments conservatives highlighted would have created the key conditions which prompted the sudden nosedive. No, I don't see this as playing any role, Allen said. For this critique to have any plausibility, SVB would have to have made woke investments that failed and caused it to implode. Also, many financial institutions have made similar investments without prompting a bank run. Okay? Robert Lawless, University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign law professor and expert in consumer finance and business law, agreed that wokeness didn't cause the bank's collapse, yada, yada. I mean, so this tells you what you clearly know, right? There's some things that are relatively intuitive. In something that is complicated as banks and investment and the stock market and speculation, things like that, the idea that simply going out of your way to try to hire people who aren't white, to try to have some diversity on your board, the idea that that would just cause a bank to collapse when every other time in American history a bank collapsing has been under the management of white people is just really stupid. And it's really inconsiderate, and it's low-key bigoted, okay? The fact of the matter is, just like white people, there are highly qualified non-white people, non-straight people, who are capable of running banks. And yes, also capable of making mistakes. But this idea that trying to diversify your management by getting other competent people who just are not white and straight, the idea that played any meaningful role. Like, for you to make a claim that ridiculous, you need to bring the receipts, baby. You need to bring proof. Where's your proof? And of course, Republicans don't have any because they're just appealing to woke as a buzzword. They're hoping that it pisses off their viewers. Oh my God, this company cared about diversity. And it just like triggers some sort of brain rot. That's what they're hoping. And I'm sure in some cases they're succeeding because many of their viewers and their supporters are inclined to believe that anyway. Don't fall for it. Think about this. Look at this video, do some reading on this. Watch Economoy's breakdown of this. It's really insightful. This has nothing to do with wokeness. And anytime someone suggests that it does, make fun of them because they deserve it. Hey, you! Thanks for watching. If you liked the video, and I hope that you did, please hit the like and subscribe buttons below. And if you absolutely hated the video, the best revenge for you is also to hit the like and subscribe buttons below. That'll teach me. If you want to share an opinion or share some feedback, go ahead and leave a comment, all right? 2023 is a year of change, hence the aggressive rebrand and commitment to new content. Inspired by my friends Luke Beasley and STV Philly, my personal goal for this channel is to hit 40,000 subscribers by the end of the year. So I'm hoping you'll do me a solid by spreading the word and the videos to potential fans and hate watchers alike. And in the meantime, we'll be pondering politics again with you very soon.